Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and recently a friend of mine, Jared Hazelbarth, started a group for adults who are going to meet on Friday nights to discuss the works of Aristotle. And while I'm not sure if I can reliably make that group or add to my schedule at the moment, I'm going to be participating in a way as much as I can. And one of the ways that I'd like to participate is by answering some of the questions that come up in the group, especially when they relate to things that I might say in a video or in the exposition of a lesson. And in the first meeting that Jared led, there was a question about logic and its relationship to the other disciplines. And this was an interesting question, and I'd like to get into it a little bit, and hopefully this will be a little helpful. It's very important before we even get started to understand that what we find in a modern university and what exists in classical philosophy or a medieval university or an ancient school of philosophy, they're two totally different worlds. And so one thing we have to be very careful of is taking words that have meaning in ancient learning or medieval education and just bringing those words over into modern education, changing the meanings of those words, and then referring to those words as if they do in fact have the same meaning in different contexts, because they don't. And logic is a good example of this, but it also applies to the use of the term philosophy and other disciplines and things like that. There's a key point that you've always got to be focused on when you talk about ancient or classical or medieval learning and modern learning. And that key point is the scientific revolution, which really sort of has its genesis or its origin in Francis Bacon's New Organon, or Novum Organum, 1620, that was written. That is a turning point where the ancient is really abandoned and something entirely new is developed. Francis Bacon referred to it as a new instauration, a new beginning of human learning. And there really is a radical change at that point in history, and we have to be careful when we use terms that we define them, both as they were used in ancient and medieval times and as they're used in modern times. For example, the term liberal arts at a modern university refers to things like history and literature, can even refer to some fine arts type studies. But that vague name of a department under which a number of different fields of study are organized, that's not what liberal arts meant in the medieval or ancient times. The same terms are used, but their meanings are changing. And this causes a lot of confusion when we try to understand what's going on in ancient thought. So when I say something like logic is a tool, and it's unlikely that I would use the word logic, because again, that's another source of confusion. I usually use the term reasoning, and there's an important reason for that. Maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. And also philosophy. Philosophy in the mind of someone like Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle is something very different than philosophy in a course catalog at a modern university. So we've got to make sure that we define these terms and we don't just use words pulled from different periods, because they have very different meanings. So when I say that reasoning is the organon or the instrument, the tool of philosophy, what I mean when I say that, and again, where did I get that idea from? It's the name of Aristotle's works on reasoning. They're called together as a system. They're called the organon, which means the instrument or the tool that's used for the pursuit of philosophy. And when I say the word philosophy, I'm talking about ancient philosophy. I'm not talking about modern university philosophy classes, which is something completely different. And if you've ever taken a modern college philosophy course, you know that it's really a study about philosophy, about the history of philosophy or what different philosophers taught and things like that. It's not philosophy itself, which is what Aristotle meant by the term, what St. Thomas Aquinas would mean by the term, and so on. So Aristotle was he was in the position of one who was conducting investigations. He was investigating the truth. He had questions that he wanted to answer. And the pursuit of the answer to those questions is what philosophy is. It's the pursuit of wisdom. The word philosophy literally means the desire for wisdom. That's what philosophy means. So when we look at how should we pursue with this wisdom, how should we go after this wisdom? Well, there are different opinions as to how we should pursue wisdom. If we were to talk to Francis Bacon and a modern scientist, they would tell us that the way to seek wisdom is by conducting experiments, by observing things, by looking through telescopes, looking through microscopes, conducting experiments and studies and things like that. And you'll notice that all of these are based on sensible observations of the natural world. Well, what happens if we're not necessarily interested in the natural world? Or what if we believe that there are immaterial or supernatural influences that ultimately determine what takes place in the natural world? Well, that requires a different instrument of investigation. And what Aristotle argued, because Aristotle did believe in God, what Aristotle argued was that modern scientific observation and experimentation is really limited in what it can reveal to us. It can reveal to us details of things, but it can't reveal to us the end for which they exist. It can't reveal to us their origin. And so these are usually some of the most important questions. So while we can gather a lot of data about specimens that we can observe, the bigger questions like where did this come from, what is this for, and so on, science is not going to answer those questions. And the other shortcoming of modern scientific observation is you're almost always observing a limited sample of an entire class of things. So for example, if we're going to give people a drug and then test the outcomes of the use of that drug, it's always going to be based on a small sample of the available class of human beings. And so all of the data that's collected is based on a sample size, and we make the leap, or we extrapolate the results. That's the technical term for it. We assume that everything that was true of the group that was sampled will also be true of the rest of people, and we make probable statements. We draw probable conclusions about the group based on the observation of a part of that group. That process, moving from a part to the whole, that's called inductive reasoning. We're led up. We go up from the part to the whole. That's inductive. That's what modern science does. That's why for all the talk about how modern science needs to be reproducible and demonstrable and so on, we find all kinds of false reports. We see scientists contradicting what scientists said a century ago, and we have to ask, how can scientists be wrong if they're discussing and drawing conclusions from observed and reproducible facts? And the answer is because inductive reasoning is at best probable, and often really isn't even probable, it's just possible. And so you can see that the shakiness of inductive reasoning, how uncertain it is, how commonly it leads us to false conclusions, is why Aristotle wasn't interested in inductive reasoning. The ancients didn't pursue modern science not because they were ignorant or dumb. It's because they really didn't believe that it was that valuable. And so what the ancient philosophers preferred was to go from an absolutely certain and sure knowledge of universal truths, and to find a way to move from universal truths down to particular conclusions about parts of groups or individuals within groups. And that's really what philosophy is about. It's about taking a knowledge of some universal truth. We can say an axiom, for example. A universal truth, taking that and then trying to figure out how can we move from that universal truth down to applications of that universal truth to particular individuals or subgroups, which are called species. That work is called deductive reasoning. So we have inductive, which we see in a poll or in a scientific experiment and things like that. And then we see deductive reasoning, where we start with a number of universal truths and we reason from them down to particulars. Now, the problem before Aristotle was that this process of reasoning wasn't understood. Plato sort of scratched the surface. Socrates understood a part of it, but the real essence of reasoning, the actual process of reasoning, wasn't understood. And so men lacked the instrument that would allow them to move from universals to particulars, which is what the philosophers wanted to do. And it was Aristotle, in his Organon, who established, by his own study and teaching, he established the art of reasoning from universals down to particulars, deductive reasoning. And that's the real merit of Aristotle's work. So reasoning, deductive reasoning, is the tool that is used for philosophy, which seeks not merely to know things, but to know things with absolute certainty, and to restrict itself to the knowledge of things that can be known with absolute certainty. And it's a very different pursuit than we find among modern scientists who are not seeking the same kind of knowledge with the same kind of certainty. It's a reasoning based on probability or possibility, and not the absolute demonstrable certainty of ancient philosophy. So two very different things. And again, we've got to make sure we define these terms in the same way that they were understood in ancient times, and be aware of our own rebranding of these terms in modern times with different meanings. So that's what I mean when I say that reasoning is the instrument of philosophy. It's the process or the art by which demonstrative reasoning is conducted, which is the kind of investigation, the kind of reasoning that was used by the ancient philosophers. Now, the reason why I don't like to use the word logic, and I'm not sure if I use that word or not, as I said, I usually use reasoning. Because there are different kinds of reasoning, and most modern students who have studied logic at a college or a university, or maybe even in a school, or just have read books on their own, they don't make this distinction, and it causes confusion in modern circles. If we look back to the ancient world, we see there's different kinds of reasoning. We see Socrates, for example. And what do we say about Socrates? We say Socrates used the Socratic method. It was a method that Socrates used. It was a certain kind of reasoning that Socrates used. That's one method. And then when Aristotle writes his Organon, it has the same idea. It's a method. It's different from Socrates' method. This is the Aristotelian method. But it includes the Socratic method. And this is what needs to be understood, because there are different kinds of reasoning that are used in different circumstances. So in the categories and on interpretation, Aristotle is sort of preparing us for what he reveals in his work on the Analytics, where we learn about demonstrative reasoning. This is the reasoning of philosophy, demonstrative reasoning. That's what philosophy uses to establish the philosophical sciences. That's what Aristotle uses to establish the ethics and the physics and the metaphysics and so on. That's the method, demonstrative reasoning. That's where we begin with absolute truth, with universal truths, and we reason from them to make applications to particulars. And that knowledge of that absolutely certain knowledge of particulars and classes, that's what Aristotle calls science. And again, it's not the same idea as modern science. So scientific knowledge is gained through demonstrative reasoning, which Aristotle teaches in the Analytics. In the Topics, Aristotle teaches what's called dialectical reasoning. It's a different kind of reasoning. Dialectical reasoning in the Topics is the Socratic method. It's what we see Socrates doing in the dialogues of Plato. Socrates doesn't start with absolutely certain truths. He doesn't start with axioms and things like that. Socrates starts by asking questions, where he presents someone with a yes or no question, and based on how they answer, that's where the reasoning begins, even if they're wrong. So you see, it's a different method of investigating. It's more of a trial and error approach to reasoning, where, hey, how about you answer this question and we'll see where it takes us. And we finally get to a place where we say, oh man, that's absurd. Obviously something you've said must be false, and then we backtrack to figure out where we chose the wrong answer, and we choose the other answer and start down that new path. And we just sort of keep going around groping in the dark like blind people until we finally come to the truth. And you can see it's not a reliable means to establishing science. And so the use of dialectical reasoning, or the Socratic method, is really just to demonstrate the error of a certain perspective, because if we grant someone the opportunity to answer the question, and then we follow that route and see where it leads us, if it leads us to absurdity, then we know that answer can't be right. So the Socratic method is good for showing us what is not true. But what the Socratic method was not able to do was lead us to understand what is, in fact, true. That positive scientific knowledge was only possible with the demonstrative reasoning that Aristotle established and taught in the Analytics. So there's a lot to understand in that, and the most important thing is you just have to keep reading Aristotle. Just keep reading. You have to get through all of his works. You have to just keep reading. He's going to explain things at different points in different books, and you just have to keep cycling through all the books of Aristotle. And like Jared mentioned in that first meeting, just be accountable to the text, be accountable to Aristotle's writings, because that's ultimately the criteria for these studies. Is as we continue to read more and more, what we thought about previous chapters or books is going to be tested by what we read in the new books as we continue in Aristotle's works. And they'll just continue to refine and clarify everything, and we'll take what we read in a later book and be able to go back and then clearly understand what we saw earlier and had some questions about. So the key is just to keep reading. Everything is explained. We just have to make the commitment to continue reading through Aristotle as a cycle of constant reading and reflection and clarifying, because that's how Aristotle's works work, as Jared mentioned at the beginning of that first meeting. So I hope that clarifies what it means when we say that reasoning is the instrument of philosophy. And again, in the modern philosophical sciences, we may say that logic is used in law, or logic is used in medicine, or logic is used in math. But what do we really mean by that? I mean, how is logic really used in math? How is logic really used in modern medicine? If you really think about it, it's not the kind of reasoning that Aristotle's talking about. It's simply observing patterns or applying a principle to a specific field. It's not discovering the principles. You see, that's the difference. It's not discovering the principles. It's not establishing the science. It's really an experimentation or investigation based on the use of the senses and instruments that simply amplify the senses. So it's not the same thing as philosophy, what we see in modern medicine. Like I said, much of modern scientific research and knowledge is merely a probable knowledge. It's not a knowledge that brings any absolute certainty. To say, if I have a headache, Tylenol will give me some relief. Is that absolutely true, or is that probable, or is that merely possible? We can see that when someone has a headache and they seek relief, they don't pursue relief as a philosopher would seek relief. They don't seek to understand for certain what the cause of the headache is and then remove the cause of the symptoms, which are the problem. In classical medicine, if you go back to Hippocrates and the ancient physicians, that's how they approached medicine. They sought the cause and sought to remove the cause. They didn't simply seek a cover or a reliever for the symptoms. They tried to identify and remove the cause. So it was a different approach in classical medicine. In modern medicine, we're really concerned with eliminating symptoms without necessarily removing the causes. And we use surgery today and all other methods that a classical, an ancient physician would have thought were crazy. So it's two very different worlds, and we have to be careful when we talk about these things, because things really do change in the 17th century with Bacon's new organon, and that's what I think causes some of that confusion. So I hope that clarifies things a little bit. If there's anything else that you'd like to talk about with regard to these things, just keep studying, raise the questions, and I'll try to contribute as much as I can. I hope that's helpful. God bless everybody.